You've worked hard for years. You showed up. You stayed consistent. You carried responsibility without complaining. You became the person others rely on, the one who gets things done. But here's the question most people avoid. Has it actually given you control? Because if you're over 40, you've probably started to feel something you can't ignore anymore. Not failure, not even being stuck, but something else, a limit. You're progressing, but only up to a point. No matter how much effort you put in, it feels like there's an invisible ceiling you can't break through. At first, it's easy to dismiss. You tell yourself, this is normal, that stability is enough, that this is just how life works. But that feeling doesn't go away. It grows, quietly, until one day you can't ignore it anymore. And that feeling isn't random. It's the result of how you've been trained to think. From the beginning, you were taught to work hard, to complete tasks, to meet expectations, to follow systems built by others. And those lessons built discipline, but they also shaped something deeper, how you see progress. You've been trained to focus on execution, not direction, on effort, not leverage. And there's nothing wrong with working hard. But if your progress depends entirely on how much time you give, then your growth will always have a limit. Because time is finite. And once it's gone, so is your ability to produce more. That's where everything begins to change. Not in what you do, but in how you think. Because a worker wakes up asking, what do I need to get done today? But an owner asks something completely different. What can I build today that continues without me? And those two questions lead to two completely different lives. Most people never make that shift. Not because they can't, but because they've spent decades reinforcing one way of thinking. They've become efficient, reliable, consistent, but always within someone else's structure. And after enough time, you start to feel it. That quiet realization, no matter how well you perform, you are still operating within limits you didn't create. Still trading time for progress. Still depending on something outside your control. That is the moment that matters. Because you now have a choice. Ignore it and continue the same pattern. Or question everything you've been taught about how progress actually works. Because thinking like an owner doesn't start with business. It starts with awareness. A different way of seeing time, value, effort. You begin to look beyond completing tasks and start thinking about creating outcomes. An owner doesn't just work harder. They think differently. They look for leverage, for systems, for ways to multiply effort instead of repeating it. They stop asking how to do more and start asking how to make what they do matter more. And once you see that difference, you can't unsee it. Once you see that difference, you begin to notice it everywhere. You start to recognize how often your time is directly exchanged for results, how your progress slows the moment you stop, how your effort, no matter how consistent, is still tied to a system that depends on your presence. And that realization changes something inside you, because you begin to understand that the problem was never your discipline. It was the structure behind your effort. You don't need to start over. You don't need to abandon everything you've built. What you need is a shift in how you think within it. Because ownership is not just about what you have. It is about how you approach everything. It is a mindset, a way of seeing opportunities where you once saw routine. A way of thinking that transforms how you make decisions, how you invest your time, and how you define progress. And as that mindset begins to grow, your behavior starts to follow. You begin to move with more intention. You stop focusing only on what needs to be finished and start focusing on what can continue. You begin to build instead of just complete. And that is where the real shift begins. Slowly at first, then more clearly. You start to feel something you may not have felt in a long time. Control. Not over everything, but over your direction. And that alone changes how you show up every day. Because now, your effort is no longer just about maintaining what exists. It becomes about expanding beyond it. So the real question is not whether you've worked hard enough. The real question is whether you've been thinking in a way that allows your effort to grow beyond your time. Because effort without leverage will always reach a ceiling. And that ceiling is not a reflection of your ability. It is a reflection of your structure. There is an identity that forms over time, quietly, without deliberate intention. You don't choose it in a single moment. You build it through repetition, through responsibility, through years of doing what is expected of you. You become reliable, capable, dependable. And over time, that becomes how you see yourself. If you were to step back and examine this identity, you would see something important. It is strong, but it is also limited, because it is built on execution, not direction. From an early stage, you were taught to perform, to complete tasks, to meet expectations, to follow systems. And through repetition, those lessons became part of how you operate. You learned that effort produces reward, that consistency produces stability, that reliability produces trust. And all of that is true, but it is not the full picture. Because while those principles build strength, they do not automatically create control. There is a gradual shift that happens. At first, you perform tasks. Then, you become someone who performs them. At first, you solve problems. Then, you become someone who solves them. And over time, your identity becomes tied to what you do, not to what you direct. This is where the limitation begins. Because when you define yourself by execution, your growth becomes tied to your ability to execute. The more you do, the more you are given. The more you are given, the more you must do. And without realizing it, you enter a cycle. A cycle where your progress is directly connected to your effort. And within that cycle, there is a limit. Not because you are incapable, but because the structure itself has boundaries. Many people reach a stage where they begin to feel this. They are not failing. They are not stagnant. They are progressing, but within a confined range. Their effort increases, but their results do not increase at the same rate. And that creates a quiet question, one that is rarely spoken, but deeply felt. Why does it feel like I can't break through? If you were to begin again, you would not ignore that question, because that question is awareness. There is also something important about this ceiling. It is not visible at the beginning. It only appears after years of repetition. At first, you believe that if you continue long enough, something greater will happen, that your effort will eventually unlock a new level. But over time, you begin to notice a pattern. Your progress follows a predictable path. It increases, but only within limits. And once you see that pattern, everything begins to change, because now you understand something critical. The ceiling was never fixed. It was accepted. There are countless examples of people who spent years within this structure. They became skilled, experienced, trusted, but their progress remained tied to their continued effort. When they stopped, their progress stopped. That is not failure. That is limitation. And the difference matters, because failure can be corrected, but limitation must be redefined. There is also a contrast you must understand. There are individuals who did not remain within this identity. They shifted from doing to directing, from effort to structure, from repetition to multiplication, and in doing so, they removed the ceiling, not by working harder, but by thinking differently. Because once you stop defining yourself by what you do and start defining yourself by what you build, everything changes. You begin to see opportunities differently. You begin to ask different questions. Not what needs to be done, but what creates value beyond this moment. Not how can I perform better, but how can this produce without me? Those questions are not small. They are transformational, because they shift your focus from effort to outcome, from action to impact. And that shift begins to reshape your identity. You no longer see yourself only as someone who executes. You begin to see yourself as someone who directs, who organizes, who builds. This transformation does not happen overnight. It is gradual, but it is powerful. Because as your thinking changes, your actions begin to change. And as your actions change, your results begin to change. And slowly, the ceiling that once felt permanent begins to disappear. Not because it was removed, but because you stopped accepting it. There is also something important about how others perceive this shift. A person who operates within a worker mindset is respected. They are valued. They are seen as essential within a system, but they are rarely seen as someone who controls the system. They are important but not independent. And if you are over 40, this distinction matters more than ever, because at this stage, you are no longer building from nothing. You are building from experience, from skill, from understanding, and if that experience remains tied only to execution, you limit its potential. But if you begin to expand beyond it, you unlock something far greater: control. Not total control, but control over your direction, over how your effort is used, over how your time is invested. And that changes everything. Because now, your work is no longer just about completing tasks. It becomes about creating outcomes. It becomes about building something that continues, something that grows, something that exists beyond your immediate effort. And once that shift begins, you cannot go back, because you now see what was always there. The difference between working and building, between effort and leverage, between limitation and expansion. And that awareness is the beginning of everything. Once you recognize that your limitation is not effort, but structure, the next step becomes clear. You must examine the system you are operating within. Because a man can be disciplined, consistent, and capable, yet still remain confined if the structure he works in is designed to reward effort, but not expansion. This structure is not hidden. It is familiar. It is what most people accept without question. From early on, you were taught that if you give time, you receive reward, that more effort leads to more income, that consistency leads to stability. And on the surface, this appears to work. It feels fair. It feels predictable. It feels safe. But within this structure, there is a condition. The reward increases, but only within limits. And those limits are not always visible at first. They reveal themselves over time. A man believes that if he continues long enough, his effort will always be matched by opportunity, that his consistency will naturally lead to expansion. But eventually, something changes. His effort continues to rise, but his growth begins to slow. And this moment is critical, because it forces a realization. Effort alone is not enough. There is also the nature of time within this system. You exchange your time for results. You give hours, energy, attention, and in return, you receive progress. But time cannot expand. It is fixed, and anything tied directly to time must also be limited by it. There comes a point where you cannot give more. You have reached your capacity. You have refined your efficiency. You are already operating at a high level. Yet your results do not increase significantly. This is not failure. This is the limit of the structure. And once you understand that, your perspective changes. Because now you begin to see that working harder within the same system will not break the ceiling. It will only reinforce it. There is also something else happening beneath the surface. The more you perform, the more responsibility you are given. And this feels like progress. But in reality, what has increased is not your control, it is your obligation. You are doing more, carrying more, managing more, but still within the same boundaries, still dependent on your continued presence, still exchanging time for results. This is the invisible trade, and most people never question it, because it feels like advancement, but advancement without control is limitation in disguise. There is also the illusion of progress. You may earn more, be recognized more, be trusted more, but your results remain tied to your effort. The moment you stop, the progress stops. And that dependency is the key issue, because where there is dependency, there is limitation. But there is another way of thinking, a different approach to structure. There are individuals who understood this early or eventually learned it through experience. They did not reject effort. They expanded beyond it. They began to focus not only on what they do, but on how what they do is structured. They asked a different question, not how can I do more, but how can what I do produce more? That question changes everything, because it introduces leverage. It introduces the idea that effort can multiply instead of repeat. That time can create something that continues beyond itself. And this is where the real shift begins. Because now you are no longer focused only on performance. You are focused on placement, where you place your effort, how it is used, what it becomes. There is also something important about this shift. It does not require you to abandon what you have built. It requires you to see it differently, to recognize where your effort is being confined, and to begin redirecting it towards something that can expand. Because effort, when placed within the right structure, produces growth. But effort within the wrong structure, no matter how great, remains limited. There is also an emotional aspect to this realization. You may feel frustration because you believe that effort alone would be enough, that if you worked hard enough, long enough, you would break through. And when that does not happen, it creates tension. But that tension is not without cause. It is the result of expectation meeting reality. And once you understand that, you can adjust. Not your effort, but your direction. There is also a subtle awareness that begins to form. You start to see that progress is not determined only by how much you do, but by how what you do is structured. And once you see that, you cannot ignore it. Because now, every action carries a question. Does this end with me, or does it continue beyond me? That question begins to guide your decisions. There is also a shift in identity that follows. You stop seeing yourself only as someone who performs, and begin to see yourself as someone who positions, someone who builds, someone who creates outcomes, not just completes tasks. This is not immediate. It requires awareness. It requires intention. But it is the beginning of control. There is also something critical you must understand. Not all work produces the same result. Even when equal effort is applied, some work ends the moment it is finished. Other work continues long after you have stopped. And that difference determines everything. If your work ends when you stop, you must always start again. But if your work continues, you begin to build something that grows. This is the difference between completing and creating. Most people are trained to complete, to finish tasks, to close cycles, to move from one responsibility to the next. And while this creates efficiency, it does not create expansion, because once the task is done, it ends, and you must begin again. This creates repetition, and repetition, without continuation, leads to limitation. But there is another way, a different type of effort, one that creates outcomes beyond the moment, one that produces something that remains, something that builds upon itself. This is not completion, this is construction. And if you were to begin again, this is where you would focus, because now your thinking begins to shift. You stop asking, what do I need to finish today? And start asking, what will this become tomorrow? That question introduces continuity. It changes the nature of your actions, because now you are no longer working for immediate results alone. You are working for something that extends beyond your effort. There is also a difference between effort that resolves and effort that multiplies. Resolving effort brings closure. Multiplying effort creates continuation. And over time, continuation leads to growth. Because now, your work does not reset each day. It builds. It compounds. It expands. There is also something powerful about this shift. It changes how you use time. When you complete tasks, you use time once. But when you build something that continues, you use time repeatedly. Your effort extends beyond the moment it was applied. And this is where leverage begins. There is also a change in how others perceive you. A person who completes work is seen as dependable, but a person who creates outcomes is seen as visionary. The first is relied upon. The second is followed. And over time, that difference becomes significant, because one remains within the system, and the other begins to move beyond it. There is also discipline required in this way of thinking, because it requires you to pause, not to delay, but to direct, to consider not just what you are doing, but what it will produce. This is not hesitation. This is intention. And intention creates alignment. There is also a compounding effect. Each action contributes to the next. Each result builds upon the last. And over time, this creates growth that does not require equal effort. because now your work carries forward. It does not reset. It continues. There is also something else that changes. You no longer need to start from zero every day, because what you built yesterday continues into today. Your progress is not lost. It is extended, and that extension is what creates expansion. There is also the emergence of control, because now your results are no longer entirely dependent on your presence. They begin to exist beyond you. And when something exists beyond your effort, you gain freedom. Not total freedom, but direction. And direction is where real control begins. There is also a final realization in this stage. A man who spends his life completing tasks will always need to begin again. But a man who builds outcomes creates something that continues, grows, and multiplies. And that is the difference, not in effort, but in thinking, not in ability, but in structure. And once you understand that, you begin to move differently. You begin to think differently. And most importantly, you begin to build differently. At this stage of your life, the truth becomes unavoidable. You were never lacking discipline. You were never lacking effort. You were never lacking commitment. What you were lacking was a different way of thinking, because for years, you did exactly what you were taught. You showed up. You worked hard. You became reliable. And that built strength. But it also built limits. Limits that were never obvious in the beginning, but became clearer over time. Not because you failed, but because the structure you operated in was never designed to give you full control. And now you see it. You feel it. That quiet awareness that something needs to change. Not dramatically. Not by starting over, but by shifting how you think about everything you do. Because the difference between staying where you are and moving forward is not effort. It is direction. A worker focuses on completing. An owner focuses on creating. A worker trades time. An owner builds something that continues. A worker asks, what needs to be done? An owner asks, what will this become? And once you begin asking that second question, everything changes. You stop seeing your time as something to spend. You begin seeing it as something to invest. You stop measuring progress by how much you finish. You begin measuring it by what continues after you stop. You stop relying on effort alone. You begin combining effort with structure. And that is where real growth begins. Because effort alone will always reach a ceiling. But effort placed within the right structure expands, multiplies, continues. And that is what gives you control. Not control over everything, but control over your direction, over how your time is used, over how your results are created. And that is enough to change everything. Understand this clearly. It is not too late. You are not behind. You are at the exact point where this realization matters most. Because now you have something you didn't have before. Experience, awareness, perspective. And when combined with the right way of thinking, those become powerful tools. So do not reject what you have built. Do not abandon your discipline. Do not walk away from your consistency. Instead, expand it. Use it differently. Direct it towards something that grows beyond you. Something that continues. Something that builds. Because in the end, the goal is not to work more. The goal is to create something that works for you. And once you make that shift, you will no longer feel confined by your effort. You will no longer feel limited by your time. You will no longer feel dependent on a system you don't control. You will begin to move with intention, with clarity, with direction. And in that movement, you will finally experience something you've been working toward all along. Not just progress, but control.